If you're in Japan and happen to work in the auto industry, now might be a good time to breathe into a paper bag. Not because you're having a panic attack, though that's fair, but because your industry is about to get hit with a 25% tariff from the land of bald eagles and unpredictable foreign policy. Welcome to What If Horizons, the podcast where we connect imaginary dots that might turn very, very real. Today, we explore a scenario more combustible than a Toyota Corolla engine running on moonshine. What if Trump's tariffs trigger a Japan-US trade war? Let's set the stage. It's early July, the humidity is high, and so is Washington's appetite for political disruption. Former President Donald Trump, who has apparently never met a tariff he didn't love, has just announced a sweeping 25% import duty on Japanese automobiles and parts. And that's bad? He's also hinted at turning the volume up to 35% if Tokyo doesn't fold by August 1st like a cheap Japanese fan. The stated reason? Leveling the playing field. The real reason? Possibly polling, ego, or an old grudge involving a Sony Walkman. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, things aren't exactly stable either. Prime Minister Ishiba, whose name translates loosely into man who just lost his upper house majority, is in no position to negotiate from strength. The timing is exquisite. On one end, the U.S. president is threatening tariffs that could upend the world's third largest economy. On the other, the Japanese leadership is desperately clinging to power, while voters sharpen their pitchforks over rising prices and economic stagnation. Add in a newly emboldened opposition and a nationalist undercurrent muttering about samurai honor and American bullying, and you've got yourself a recipe for geopolitical indigestion. Here's what's really at stake. Japan's auto industry is not a side hustle. It's not a cute export tucked into a shipping container between Hello Kitty plushies and anime DVDs. It accounts for 28% of Japan's exports. That's right, more than a quarter of what Japan sells to the world has four wheels and probably better mileage than your Ford F-150. It also supports about 5.6 million jobs in Japan, many of which depend directly or indirectly on access to the massive American market. Slap a 25% tariff on those cars, and suddenly that sleek Lexus starts to look a little less appealing to American buyers already eyeballing rising interest rates and a gallon of gas price like a small latte. But don't think this is just Japan's problem, because if there's one thing history has taught us, it's that starting a trade war is a lot easier than winning one. And it's a whole lot more painful when both parties bring bazookas to a tax policy knife fight. For the United States, jacking up tariffs on Japanese vehicles isn't just a matter of punishing foreign automakers. It means American consumers will be the ones footing the bill when their next car costs thousands more. It means U.S. dealerships will suddenly have a lot more Subarus collecting dust on their lots and a lot fewer happy customers. And it means Detroit, yes Detroit, that proud post-industrial phoenix trying to rise from the economic ashes, might not be thrilled to watch its Japanese rivals go down in flames. Because like it or not, the global auto industry is a tangled mess of mutual dependencies. Many American car models rely on Japanese parts, raise tariffs on those, and suddenly it's not just Toyotas taking a hit. It's Chevys, Jeeps, and that random electric truck no one asked for. Meanwhile, Trump's strategy is clear as ever. Squeeze Japan economically until they scream uncle, or until Fox News runs a segment blaming anime for the trade deficit. With G7 talks looming and no major breakthroughs in sight, August 1st is looking more like a countdown to confrontation than a diplomatic deadline. And if no deal is reached, those tariffs could jump to 30 or even 35% because apparently inflation isn't high enough yet. Let's not forget the domestic political calculus here. Trump knows tariffs play well with a certain slice of the electorate. They're tangible, dramatic, and easy to spin. We're protecting American jobs. Never mind that those jobs might suffer downstream consequences. Meanwhile, Ishiba has little room to maneuver. Conceding to American pressure would be political suicide, handing his rivals a narrative of weakness. Standing firm, however, risks plunging Japan into economic crisis. In short, both sides are locked in a high-stakes game of economic chicken, with millions of jobs and billions in trade hanging in the balance. So what happens if this gets worse? What if Tokyo retaliates? What if the yen goes haywire and Japanese investors yank billions from U.S. markets? What if this isn't just another headline, but the beginning of a seismic realignment between two historic allies? We'll get into all that in the next part. But for now, remember this. In global economics, the butterfly effect doesn't flap its wings. It revs an engine, slaps on a tariff, and crashes headfirst into your monthly car payment. To understand how we got here and how fast this could all spiral, we need to rewind the clock just a few weeks. In early July, former President Donald Trump, in one of his signature press conferences held somewhere between defiance and theater, declared that a new 25% import duty would be levied on Japanese automobiles and auto parts. This move came on top of existing duties already slapped on Japanese steel and aluminum, which had been languishing under a 50% surcharge since his earlier administration. For Tokyo, it was not so much a surprise as it was a gut punch that had been long telegraphed through campaign rhetoric and populist sound bites.
But why automobiles? Why now?
The answer lies somewhere between economics and symbolism. Japanese cars have long been a source of both admiration and resentment in the American market. They are seen as more reliable, often more fuel efficient, and, let us be honest, less likely to spontaneously combust when the air conditioning is on. The truth is, American consumers love Japanese cars.
The problem is, politicians love political leverage more.
By targeting Japan's most valuable export sector, Trump is essentially twisting the economic knife. The automotive industry represents nearly 1/3 of Japan's export earnings. That is not a sector, it is a national artery. The industry supports around 5,600,000 jobs in Japan and anchors entire regions from Aichi to Gunma. These are not just factory jobs, they include logistics, engineering, marketing, and research and development. Tariffs on automobiles do not just strike at profit margins, they threaten the economic fabric of Japanese society. And just as Japan was absorbing the shock of the tariff announcement, another tremor hit from inside its own political house. In mid-July, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's ruling coalition suffered a bruising loss in the upper house elections. Though technically still in power, Ishiba emerged weakened, his legislative majority clipped, and his ability to push forward controversial policy now under siege from both opposition lawmakers and grumbling factions within his own party. His approval ratings, already teetering, began to wobble further as critics accused him of being soft in the face of American aggression. The timing could not have been worse. Ishiba, once seen as a steady if uncharismatic hand on the tiller, suddenly looked like a lame duck walking into a hurricane. And this has real consequences. A leader who lacks domestic strength is less likely to make bold concessions abroad. Worse, they are more likely to dig in, play to nationalist sentiment, and escalate rather than compromise. Add to this a chorus of opposition figures calling for retaliation, and one begins to see how a simple trade dispute can morph into a political quagmire. Let us not forget that Japan's economy is already skating on thin ice. Growth has been stagnant for years. The population is aging faster than the average dairy product, and inflation, while not as monstrous as in other parts of the world, is beginning to eat away at wages and household budgets. Now imagine throwing a major trade shock into that equation. Imagine the price of exporting a vehicle to the United States jumping by 1/4 overnight. Sales plummet. Factory orders slow. Plants reduce shifts or shut down entirely. Suddenly, you are not just talking about economic pain, you are talking about a recession triggered by policy, not market forces.
And yet, it is not just Tokyo that has reason to be nervous.
Across the Pacific, American consumers are already bracing for higher costs. Tariffs may be levied on foreign producers, but the bill is often paid by domestic buyers. That sleek Honda Accord sitting on the dealership floor adds several $1,000s to the sticker price. That reliable Toyota pickup, say hello to longer financing terms and tighter credit conditions. Meanwhile, American auto manufacturers, many of which rely on Japanese parts for their own assembly lines, now find themselves in the awkward position of cheering nationalist rhetoric while quietly lobbying to be spared from its consequences. But the markets do not wait for speeches or slogans. They respond to numbers. And already, financial analysts are warning of volatility. The Japanese yen is swinging like a pendulum as investors attempt to price in risk. Bond yields are moving. Export forecasts are being revised downward. Japanese automakers are trimming earnings projections and exploring cost-cutting measures. This is not speculative fiction. This is the machinery of the global economy grinding under political pressure. And it is not just about cars. The whispering has already begun that if Japan does not bend by the time the leaders gather for the Group of Seven summit, Trump might widen the scope of tariffs. Possible new targets include rice, semiconductors, and even pharmaceuticals, sectors that touch every corner of Japanese industry, and in some cases, American health care and electronics as well. In short, if Tokyo does not yield up, the United States may start swinging at everything with a Made in Japan label. All of this creates a scenario in which escalation is not only possible, it is likely. The August 1st deadline is not just a calendar marker, it is a trigger point. If no deal is reached, the tariff rate could be pushed even higher, possibly to 30 or 35%. Each tick upward will tighten the noose around Japan's economy and fan the flames of domestic outrage.
And that in turn makes compromise politically toxic for Ishiba.
So where does this go from here? Does Japan retaliate? Does it play the long game through the World Trade Organization? Does it look east to China and south to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations for new trade partnerships? Or does it stand its ground and gamble that the American economy too will flinch? In the next section, we will follow the worst-case scenario. What happens if the trade conflict becomes a full-blown war of tariffs, counter-tariffs, and strategic recalculations? A scenario where decades of post-war cooperation unraveled not with bombs or treaties, but with spreadsheets and shipping manifests. Trade wars are not fought in trenches or with missiles. They are waged in boardrooms, across customs checkpoints, and through the cold language of tariffs, quotas, and retaliatory measures. And if the standoff between the United States and Japan escalates as feared, we may witness one of the most consequential trade conflicts between allies in the post-war era. Let us imagine the weeks after the initial tariffs go into effect. The Japanese government, under immense domestic pressure, issues a formal protest but stops short of retaliation at first. It seeks to de-escalate, proposing emergency talks, even offering to increase Japanese investments in American manufacturing. But Trump, emboldened by polling gains and rally cheers, refuses to budge. Instead, he tweets in all capital letters that Japan has taken advantage of America too long. That ends now. The rhetoric fuels the fire. The Japanese public, already frustrated by perceived subservience to American interests, begins to turn against Ishiba. Nationalist lawmakers push forward a retaliatory bill to impose mirror tariffs on American agricultural goods, corn, beef, and soybeans to start. These are precision strikes, targeting states where Trump's political base is strong. And the message is clear: if you hit our cars, we will hit your farmers. Within days, American agricultural lobbies sound the alarm. The National Corn Growers Association warns of catastrophic losses. Soy prices dip. Midwestern governors demand exemptions. But the administration refuses to blink. And that is when the second punch lands. Japan suspends a pending purchase of Lockheed Martin F-35 fighter jets, a deal worth billions. Officially, the reason cited is budgetary adjustments. Unofficially, it is a shot across the bow. The markets begin to panic. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 drops 3% in a single day. The Dow Jones follows suit. American automakers are now facing supply chain disruptions as Japanese suppliers cancel contracts or raise prices. Toyota and Nissan begin reallocating production to plants in Thailand and Mexico to avoid tariff exposure. This comes at the cost of hundreds, eventually thousands of jobs in Japan. The backlash is immediate. Protests erupt in Nagoya, home to Toyota's headquarters. Young workers, already squeezed by high rents and stagnant wages, accuse their government of weakness and their ally betrayal.
And it does not stop there.
The Japanese yen begins to strengthen as investors flee to safety, ironically worsening Japan's export competitiveness. At the same time, the United States imposes a fresh round of tariffs on Japanese semiconductors and medical imaging equipment, sectors vital to Japan's advanced tech economy.
The message from Washington is unmistakable. There will be no capitulation.
Faced with economic hemorrhaging and political pressure, Japan's parliament convenes an emergency session. For the first time in decades, lawmakers openly discuss trade diversification away from the United States. Delegations are dispatched to Beijing, New Delhi, and Jakarta. Quietly, deals are brokered. New pipelines of exports begin to emerge. American firms find themselves locked out of these talks. What was once the most reliable alliance in Asia is now looking elsewhere for economic shelter.
This shift is not just commercial, it is strategic.
China sees an opportunity and moves swiftly. President Xi Jinping offers Japan favorable trade terms and access to the regional comprehensive economic partnership on an expedited basis. China's message, America is unreliable. Asia must look after its own. And while Japan does not embrace China politically, it accepts the olive branch economically. Suddenly, Tokyo is signing deals it would have avoided just a year earlier. And Washington is watching its closest Asian ally drift toward its greatest rival. Meanwhile, American companies begin to feel the sting. Consumer prices rise. Imported goods become more expensive. Automobiles, electronics, even pharmaceutical equipment all are caught in the crossfire. Inflation ticks upward again. And voters who once cheered on the tariffs begin to grumble at the supermarket checkout line and the car dealership.
Trump's approval rating among independents begins to wobble.
In Japan, Ishiba's coalition crumbles further. Facing plummeting support, he steps down. A snap election is called. The new leader, more populist, more hawkish, enters office vowing to never again allow Japan to be economically humiliated. The new cabinet includes former trade hardliners and nationalists who speak openly of rearming the economy against foreign interference. The United States and Japan are not enemies, but in this scenario, they are no longer natural partners either. And that is the hidden cost of trade wars, not just economic pain, but a reshuffling of global relationships that had once been forged in fire and tempered by trust. What began as a squabble over import duties now threatens to unravel an alliance built over 70 years. In the next part, we will examine the global ripple effects of this conflict. Because when two of the world's largest economies clash, no country is left untouched. From Europe's automakers to Australia's grain exporters to Southeast Asia's emerging economies, the shockwaves spread far and fast. The moment Japan and the United States enter into a tit-for-tat trade war, the global economy begins to feel the tremors. International markets thrive on predictability, on trust between trading partners, and most of all, on the assumption that alliances among the world's economic superpowers are stable. But in this unfolding scenario, that assumption shatters. The question is no longer whether there will be consequences, it is how wide and deep they will run. The first sector to be visibly shaken is the global automobile industry. Japanese vehicles account for a substantial share of car sales, not just in the United States, but also across Latin America, Southeast Asia, Europe, and Oceania. As tariffs push up the cost of Japanese cars in the United States, consumers begin looking elsewhere, toward Korean, German, and even Chinese alternatives. But these suppliers are themselves enmeshed in the same global supply chain. Many components in Hyundai, Volkswagen, and even General Motors vehicles originate in Japan. Brake systems, electric batteries, precision sensors, transmissions. The ripple effect is swift and brutal. Within weeks, factories in Ohio and Tennessee, where Japanese automakers have U.S. manufacturing plants, announced layoffs. Not because production has stopped entirely, but because key parts from Japan are either too expensive or delayed by new customs protocols. Logistics firms scramble to reroute shipments through third countries like Vietnam or Malaysia to exploit loopholes. But that strategy only lasts so long before the United States Trade Representative closes those doors too. Compliance inspections tighten. Customs delays stretch from hours to days, then days to weeks. Meanwhile, Japanese companies begin scaling back investment in the United States. Toyota cancels a planned research facility in North Carolina. Honda pauses expansion plans in Indiana. Nissan shelves its electric vehicle rollout for the U.S. market, pivoting instead to Europe. The message from Japan's corporate boardrooms is clear. If the United States weaponizes trade, then Japan will defend itself with relocation. As tensions grow, investors across the globe seek safer assets. Capital flows into gold, Swiss francs, and German bonds. The Japanese yen, paradoxically seen as a safe haven despite the trade crisis, strengthens against the dollar. That makes Japanese exports even more expensive, compounding their economic difficulties. Meanwhile, American companies that depend on Japanese components, especially in high-tech sectors, scramble for alternatives. But supply chains cannot be rebuilt overnight. Factories in Oregon and California are idle for weeks waiting on precision microchips and high-grade specialty steel from Japan.
And then comes the global diplomatic reaction.
Europe, long wary of Trump's tariff-first approach, begins preparing for a scenario in which the United States imposes similar duties on German cars. The European Commission holds emergency talks with Berlin, Paris, and Rome. A proposal emerges: form a defensive trade bloc that strengthens internal European supply chains and deepens trade ties with Japan and South Korea. Essentially, it is a 21st century version of Fortress Europe, built not to expand, but to survive the turbulence coming from across the Atlantic. South Korea and Australia, watching events unfold, begin reassessing their security and economic ties. If Washington is willing to damage Japan, its closest East Asian ally, for domestic political gain, who is next? Seoul accelerates trade talks with Jakarta and Hanoi. Canberra begins quiet talks with Tokyo about new bilateral trade channels and a Pacific resilience strategy that might blunt American unpredictability. In Beijing, the mood is cautiously optimistic. The Communist Party leadership knows better than to celebrate openly, but the opportunity is too rich to ignore. China quickly proposes a Japan-Korea free trade agreement, something that had languished in technical discussions for years. The message is shrewd and strategic. If Washington wants to isolate Japan, then China is ready to embrace it, selectively of course, and with terms that benefit Beijing. And here lies the strategic consequence most overlooked by tariff evangelists. Every trade rupture creates space for a geopolitical shift. In the vacuum of a fraying U.S.-Japan alliance, China positions itself as the regional stabilizer, the reasonable negotiator, the economic lifeline. It does not need to win Japan's loyalty overnight. It only needs to sow enough doubt in Tokyo to make every future negotiation with Washington more difficult. As this new reality takes shape, international institutions begin to wobble. The World Trade Organization, long sidelined and mocked, finds itself irrelevant in real time. Japan's attempt to file a complaint is met with procedural gridlock. Appointments to the dispute resolution body have been blocked by the United States for years. The G7, once a forum for economic coordination among allies, becomes a venue for finger-pointing and posturing. At the summit in Montreal, Prime Minister Ishiba delivers a terse, clipped address and exits the stage without shaking the U.S. president's hand.
The headlines are blunt: allies in name, rivals in trade.
In the United Nations, ambassadors from emerging economies begin to raise concerns. If the global economic order is breaking down, what happens to debt repayments, commodity contracts, or climate finance commitments? Many African and South American nations, relying on both Japanese and American investment, now face uncertainty. Currency markets become jittery. Loan terms shift. Development slows.
And then come the unintended consequences.
A small pharmaceutical company in Osaka, which produces an advanced cancer treatment used in the United States, announces that it can no longer export the drug profitably due to rising shipping costs and raw material tariffs. The Food and Drug Administration scrambles to find substitutes. A children's hospital in Chicago delays treatments. For all the grand talk of economic sovereignty, it is the patients, consumers, and workers who begin to feel the most tangible pain. Trade wars are not abstract. They did not only occur in policy think tanks or on news channels. They happen in shipping containers, hospital supply closets, auto repair shops, and farms. And when two of the world's largest economies go to economic war, there are no neutral countries and no unscathed industries. In the next part, we will zoom in on the political and diplomatic fallout. The bond between Washington and Tokyo, once hailed as unshakable, is now under historic strain. What happens when that trust breaks? And what does it mean for peace and stability in Asia? When a trade war erupts between the United States and Japan, the battlefield is not confined to balance sheets or shipping manifests. It expands into the delicate realm of diplomacy, where every word, handshake, and canceled summit carries geopolitical weight. And in this unfolding scenario, the diplomatic toll may prove even more profound than the economic one. For decades, the alliance between the United States and Japan has been a cornerstone of stability in the Indo-Pacific. Born out of post-World War II reconstruction, institutionalized through security pacts and trade agreements, and solidified during the Cold War, this alliance was never just about economics. It was about trust. A trust that Washington would protect Tokyo in times of peril. A trust that Japan would stand by the United States in its global missions. A trust that, at the very least, economic disputes would be handled through diplomacy, not through politically motivated trade salvos designed to appease Rust Belt voters.
But trust, once broken, is not so easily repaired.
Japan's political leadership finds itself at a crossroads. On one side is tradition, a deeply rooted alliance with the United States, economic interdependence, and decades of close cooperation. On the other side is political survival. Prime Minister Ishiba, whose popularity once rested on his ability to maintain strong ties with Washington, now faces pressure from the Japanese public and opposition parties to assert national dignity. Protests erupt in Tokyo and Osaka.
In the Diet, the Japanese parliament members demand a reorientation of Japan's foreign policy.
For the first time in a generation, voices within Japan's foreign ministry openly question the utility of the security alliance with the United States. If trade can be weaponized so casually, what guarantees are there that defense obligations will not be too? Behind closed doors, the Ministry of Defense begins reviewing contingency plans that once seemed unthinkable, enhancing Japan's independent defense capabilities, including cyber warfare programs, satellite surveillance, and in whispers, yes whispers, conversations about nuclear latency. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood is defensive. The administration insists that tariffs are about fairness, not betrayal, but the damage is done. The National Security Council scrambles to contain the fallout, hosting emergency meetings with defense officials to assure Japan that military ties remain strong. But Tokyo's representatives are stone-faced. The message from Japan is cold and clear. If economic coercion is your new language, we must now speak a different dialect. This shift sends ripples across Asia. South Korea, still nursing wounds from its own skirmishes with the United States over defense, cost sharing, and trade, accelerates talks with Tokyo on a new regional security framework. Singapore quietly convenes a summit of ASEAN leaders to discuss contingency planning for regional supply chain disruptions. Even India, a rising power with its own delicate ties to Washington and Tokyo, sees an opportunity. Prime Minister Modi offers to host a trilateral economic forum, India, Japan, and Australia, as a hedge against American unpredictability. Diplomatic cables between Washington's embassies in Asia report a consistent theme: allies are rattled, not just by the tariffs themselves, but by the precedent they set. If Japan can be targeted so brazenly, what does that say about America's understanding of alliance politics in the 21st century? Diplomacy, after all, is not simply about national interest. It is about signaling. And the signal coming out of Washington is confusion. In Brussels, the European Union takes notice. Long suspicious of the United States' transactional approach under the current administration, Europe begins to reevaluate its strategic partnerships. France and Germany announced a joint mission to Tokyo, not only to offer economic support but also to send a symbolic message: the West does not end at the Potomac. The European Investment Bank unveils a new plan to deepen infrastructure investment in Japan and Southeast Asia, branding it as a counterbalance to both American tariffs and Chinese Belt and Road initiatives. At the United Nations, the diplomatic friction becomes visible. In a routine vote on climate finance mechanisms, Japan abstains, citing uncertainty over American leadership. It is a small gesture, but symbolically powerful. Allies begin to hedge, align, realign, and maneuver.
And then comes the crisis that exposes the real cost of broken trust.
In the East China Sea, a maritime standoff escalates between Chinese Coast Guard vessels and Japanese fishing boats near the contested Senkaku Islands. It is the kind of incident that has occurred many times before, dangerous but usually contained. This time, however, the usual coordination between U.S. and Japanese military channels is slow. Messages are delayed.
Strategic ambiguity reigns.
The U.S. Department of Defense issues a generic statement calling for calm and restraint among all parties. But Japan interprets the lukewarm language as a signal: do not expect automatic backing this time. Within hours, Tokyo mobilizes a special security committee and begins diplomatic outreach to Canberra, London, and New Delhi.
The old reflex to call Washington first has eroded.
Domestically, American political elites try to spin the narrative. Some claim that the tariffs were a negotiating tactic, that the alliance is as strong as ever, that the United States remains Japan's most important partner. But the reality on the ground is harder to paper over. Japanese voters are angry. Japanese corporations are wary. Japanese diplomats are skeptical. And the foundation of one of the world's most important alliances has cracked. Trade wars may begin in boardrooms and campaign rallies, but they do not end there. They bleed into embassies, into military alliances, into the corridors of multilateral institutions. They rewrite relationships. They redraw maps of influence. They embolden rivals and confuse friends. And perhaps most dangerously, they remind every country watching that even the strongest alliance can be undone by one man with a pen and a grievance. In the next part, we will turn inward, back to the United States, where the political, economic, and cultural consequences of this Japan-United States trade war begin to reshape the American domestic landscape. What happens when American voters start feeling the sting of their own government's policy choices? Back home in the United States, the effects of the trade war with Japan are no longer confined to headlines or think tank roundtables. They are felt in living rooms, factories, and congressional town halls across the country. What began as a high-stakes geopolitical gamble is now unfolding as a full-blown domestic crisis, reshaping political loyalties, consumer behavior, and the myth of American manufacturing revival. In the American Midwest, once heralded as the backbone of the nation's industrial heritage, workers watched with a sense of whiplash. For years, politicians had promised a return of factories, the revival of steel towns, and a new golden age of Made in America. The tariffs on Japanese automobiles and electronics were sold to the public as part of this nationalist renaissance, a way to protect American jobs, level the playing field, and punish foreign competition. But now that Japan has retaliated, the backlash is biting in unexpected places. First come the layoffs. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, all of which operate major plants in states like Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi, begin scaling back production. Not because Americans are buying fewer cars, but because the cost of parts, many of which are imported from Japan, has spiked dramatically. Assembly lines stall. Logistics chains get snarled. Thousands of American workers, ironically employed by Japanese manufacturers, are handed pink slips. These are not abstract job losses. They are real, raw, and televised. Then there are the farmers. Rural America, already battered by earlier trade spats with China and the European Union, now finds itself cut off from one of its most reliable customers. Japan had long been a top importer of American beef, corn, and soybeans. But in response to the tariff war, Tokyo imposes restrictions on agricultural imports. Suddenly, shipments are canceled. Silos remain full. Prices drop. Tractors sit idle in fields as farmers demand to know, how did protecting Detroit's past mean destroying Iowa's future? In urban centers, the consumer backlash is quieter but no less powerful. Electronics stores raise prices on Japanese products, televisions, cameras, gaming consoles. A new PlayStation now costs significantly more than it did just months ago. Smartphones assembled with Japanese components suffer from delays and glitches. Small business owners, photographers, designers, technicians are squeezed as equipment costs rise. The average consumer, once indifferent to foreign trade policy, begins to feel the pinch in credit card statements and shrinking paychecks.
And all this unfolds in an election year.
In Washington, the political knives come out. The president's advisors insist the tariffs were necessary, that short-term pain will yield long-term gain. But the narrative is slipping. A bipartisan coalition in Congress calls for an immediate rollback of the trade measures. Governors in affected states demand federal relief packages.
The Department of Commerce scrambles to assemble a compensation plan for displaced workers, but it is too little, too late.
Cable news splits into partisan chaos. On one channel, commentators praise the president for standing up to foreign exploitation and urge Americans to endure the hardship in the name of economic sovereignty. On another, economists show graphs of tanking exports, ballooning trade deficits, and rising consumer debt. Town halls grow tense. Voters shout. Ironically, the sectors that were supposed to benefit most from the tariffs, domestic auto manufacturers, steel mills, and electronic startups, failed to thrive. Detroit's Big Three had hoped to regain market share, but they faced their own problems: inflation, rising interest rates, and lack of innovation. American-made cars, though now marginally cheaper than their Japanese competitors, still struggle to meet consumer expectations. The same old complaints persist: outdated design, poor fuel efficiency, inconsistent quality. The market is no longer patriotic, it is pragmatic, and it is disillusioned. In Silicon Valley, tech firms dependent on rare earth elements and precision components sourced from Japan begin lobbying for exemptions. Apple, Intel, and Nvidia all issue warnings to shareholders about supply disruptions. The venture capital ecosystem contracts slightly as risk appetite wanes. Meanwhile, startups exploring new green energy solutions find themselves locked out of Japanese battery technologies that have previously been available through open partnerships. At the cultural level, the fissures are just as pronounced. Once friendly images of Japan, samurai, sushi, anime, cherry blossoms, are now repackaged through the lens of resentment. Late-night comedy shows mock the situation with bitter sarcasm. Internet memes blame globalists for betraying America's interests. And among some corners of the electorate, xenophobic rhetoric surges, dredging up uncomfortable echoes of the 1980s when anti-Japanese sentiment reached its peak. But there are also voices of reason. Civil society groups, labor unions, student organizations, and a growing chorus of academics begin organizing public forums and online campaigns. Their message is clear: economic nationalism is not a strategy, it is a tantrum. If the United States wants to compete globally, it must do so through innovation, investment, and collaboration, not by waging economic war on its closest allies. One particularly powerful moment captures national attention. At a Senate hearing, a laid-off auto worker from Kentucky testifies with raw honesty. "I lost my job because of a trade war that was supposed to help me. But it was not Japan that put me out of work. It was my own government." The quote goes viral. By the end of the summer, the political climate has changed. Public support for the tariffs collapses. Polls show that a majority of Americans believe the trade war with Japan was a mistake. The president's approval rating drops sharply in key swing states. Opponents seize the momentum, promising to restore trade relations, repair alliances, and revive the very jobs that have been sacrificed at the altar of bravado. And yet, even as political winds shift, the deeper damage remains. The trust deficit between the American people and their leaders has widened. The myth of simple solutions has been exposed, and the long-term consequences for America's place in the global economy and the hearts of its citizens are just beginning to unfold. Up next, we will examine how this trade war reverberates beyond America and Japan, reshaping global economic alignments, empowering new regional players, and perhaps marking the start of a new era of multipolar trade blocs. While the United States grapples with the fallout of its self-inflicted trade debacle, the rest of the world quietly reorients. There is no international summit, no dramatic declaration, no new Cold War carved in stone. Instead, the global economy does what it does best when empires fumble. It adapts. The trade war between Japan and the United States, rather than drawing clear battle lines, unshackles a series of unintended consequences that stretch far beyond the Pacific. In East Asia, Japan does not retreat, it pivots. Cut off from the American market and increasingly disillusioned with Washington's erratic leadership, Tokyo accelerates its engagement with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the multilateral trade agreement spanning much of Asia. South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Australia become key partners. What was once a bureaucratic acronym on policy whiteboards now turns into a bustling network of commerce. Japanese automakers reroute supply chains to Southeast Asia. Electronic component firms establish new joint ventures in India. The future, it seems, no longer points toward Los Angeles. It curves eastward toward Jakarta and Mumbai. China, meanwhile, watches from the sidelines with barely concealed glee. For years, it had been the primary target of American trade ire, forced to defend its global supply chain from tariffs, sanctions, and blacklists. But now, Washington's fury has turned to Tokyo, and Beijing, never one to waste a strategic opportunity, moves in with velvet gloves. High-level diplomatic visits between Chinese and Japanese officials increase. Symbolic gestures, cooperation on climate research, shared infrastructure projects begin to thaw what had long been a frosty relationship. Quietly, a new axis of pragmatic convenience is born. Even Europe gets in on the game. The European Union, previously hampered by its own internal disputes, seizes the moment to fill the vacuum left by the fraying United States-Japan alliance. German carmakers offer to increase exports to Japan, sensing a lucrative opportunity. France courts Japanese tech firms with tax breaks and diplomatic niceties. Brussels makes a grand speech about rules-based trade, while swiftly negotiating a preferential deal with Tokyo that includes everything from renewable energy to digital services. And so, ironically, the world becomes more interconnected, just not in the way Washington imagined. What the United States envisioned as a muscular assertion of economic dominance ends up accelerating its marginalization. Japan, a nation once tethered to American security and trade structures, finds itself liberated, albeit reluctantly. It builds new partnerships, deepens regional integration, and diversifies dependencies that had long been dangerously concentrated. Of course, this shift is not without complexity. Some Japanese firms struggle to replace American consumer demand. Luxury brands in certain entertainment sectors, heavily reliant on American audiences, face short-term turbulence, but innovation thrives under pressure. Japanese media giants push deeper into global streaming markets. Car manufacturers tailor new models for emerging economies. Semiconductor firms pivot toward cutting-edge green technologies. The crisis, in other words, becomes a laboratory for reinvention. Back in the halls of the World Trade Organization, yes, that venerable institution most people forgot still existed, there is a flurry of legal activity. Both the United States and Japan file competing claims of unfair practices, intellectual property violations, and national security exceptions. WTO panels deliberate, nod solemnly, and issue findings that neither party respects. It is a legal theater, one that underscores how fragile the global rules-based order has become. Everyone nods along, but no one waits for the verdict. Meanwhile, smaller nations start to hedge. Thailand signs dual agreements with Japan and China. Canada opens a new trade mission in Osaka. Kenya, watching from a distance, invites Japanese investment in exchange for port rights. The world is not choosing sides, it is multiplying them. In this fractured economic landscape, loyalty is less important than flexibility, and ideology is less relevant than bandwidth. The United States, for its part, becomes increasingly isolated in the forums it once dominated. At the G7, it finds Japan aligning more frequently with European and Asian allies on economic matters. At APEC, American officials are greeted politely but not deferentially. Washington's credibility, already strained by years of erratic policy reversals, now looks structurally impaired. Even traditional allies begin to whisper, if the United States can turn on Japan, what hope does anyone else have? And yet, in some corners of the American establishment, a strange optimism endures. Certain think tanks insist this is a necessary course correction, a painful divorce from globalization that will ultimately restore national sovereignty. Others argue the world needs a jolt to move beyond outdated dependencies. And in fairness, not all consequences are dire. A few American tech firms, now unable to rely on Japanese parts, invest in domestic research labs. Local entrepreneurs attempt to revive manufacturing hubs in unexpected places like Boise, Tulsa, and Buffalo. But the broader picture remains clear. The global economic center of gravity is shifting. Not toward a single new hegemon, but toward a multipolar matrix of regional alliances, transactional diplomacy, and hedged bets. It is not a neat world, nor a predictable one, but it is perhaps more resilient. And in a way, that might be the true legacy of this trade war, not the collapse of an alliance, but the end of economic monogamy. Coming up next, we will examine how cultural narratives, public opinion, and historical memory are reshaped on both sides of the Pacific, and how a single tariff decision becomes folklore, cautionary tale, and political weapon for generations to come. Some wars are fought with missiles, others with microchips, tariffs, and movie scripts. By the time the dust settles on the Japan-United States trade war, it is no longer just a matter of numbers on balance sheets or headlines on financial news. The conflict seeps into something deeper and more enduring public imagination: cultural identity. National Making. In Japan, the government does not miss a beat. Within weeks of the American tariff hikes, a wave of soft power counter-programming floods Japanese television and film. A new animated blockbuster titled Alliance becomes a surprise hit, featuring a thinly veiled metaphor about two giant mechs, one noble, honorable, and blue-striped, the other red and erratic, swinging wildly at everything in sight. Children adore it. Adults nod grimly. Toy sales skyrocket. The message lands. Newspapers in Tokyo launch retrospectives on the 1980s trade tensions, reminding readers of a time when Japan stood up to American pressure before. Historical documentaries revisit the Plaza Accord, the forced appreciation of the yen, and the shuttering of local industries. This time, the refrain is different: never again. University students debate what a post-American world would look like. Japanese hip-hop artists reference tariff trauma in their lyrics. One viral track includes the line, "Biden raised a wall, but we built the bridge to Seoul." Satirical manga strips show Washington, D.C. as a senile old man chasing ghosts of lost factories with a baseball bat labeled 20% duty. The United States becomes, quite unintentionally, a character in Japan's national coming-of-age story. In the United States, meanwhile, the narrative spirals in the opposite direction. Pundits on television accuse Japan of betrayal. After everything we did for them, one talking head cries on a primetime cable news show, conveniently forgetting that terrorists were the opening punch. Conservative radio hosts dust off 1980s xenophobia like a long-lost vinyl. They took our tech, our jobs, and now our trade routes. One intones between ads for erectile dysfunction supplements and freeze-dried emergency food kits. But it is not just the political fringe. Popular culture joins in. A gritty reboot of an old spy series depicts a Japanese tech mogul as the shadowy puppet master behind a plot to cripple American AI industries. A best-selling thriller novel written suspiciously fast features a fictional president battling a cabal of East Asian trade saboteurs. Late-night comedians attempt satire, but the laughs come thinly. The mood is defensive. Wounded pride is hard to joke about. Schools begin to alter how they teach post-war history. Textbooks in Texas and Florida introduce new units on trade fairness and American sovereignty. Think tanks push out reports with titles like The Tokyo Trap and Rising Sun Setting Trade. Economic anxiety turns cultural and then political. Governors in Rust Belt states start calling for expanded Buy American laws, even as domestic industries beg for exceptions. Meanwhile, social media becomes a toxic petri dish for misinformation. Wild theories circulate on fringe platforms that Japan orchestrated the whole thing to bring down the dollar. Influencers with zero economics background confidently explain why sushi is a geopolitical weapon. Some begin boycotting anime. Others burn Sony PlayStations on TikTok. It is a festival of overreaction and also an effective political cudgel. The 2026 midterms are shaped in no small part by this narrative. One wing of the Republican Party campaigns on the slogan "Reclaim Our Trade," accusing Democrats of being soft on Asian economies. Democrats, for their part, fail to find a coherent message. Some call for de-escalation and diplomacy. Others insist on retaliatory tariffs against Japanese agriculture or tech. The only consensus is confusion. And in this chaotic cultural stew, a new kind of Cold War brews, not driven by ideology but by resentment, nostalgia, and the ache of diminished expectations. It is no longer just about who makes your car or your phone. It is about who gets to define your national story. And increasingly, both countries seem determined to define themselves against each other.
But here is where things take a strange turn.
While politicians shout and cultural warriors rage, the next generation quietly moves on. Young Japanese consumers buy fewer American brands, not out of spite, but because Korean or homegrown alternatives now feel cooler. American teenagers, meanwhile, do not abandon Japanese media altogether. They just pirate it instead of streaming it legally, rationalizing it as a blow against the trade enemy. Student exchanges drop in number, but gain in intimacy. Those who do study abroad become accidental ambassadors, forging friendships that contradict the headlines. Musicians collaborate across borders. Indie game developers form joint teams. A niche trend on Instagram features Americans recreating traditional Japanese crafts, while Japanese influencers post videos titled "What I Learned from My American Host Family." In other words, while the older generations write manifestos and pass tariffs, the youth of both countries quietly rebel in the most subversive way possible. They connect. And so the true impact of the trade war remains ambiguous. On the surface, it fractures alliances, upends economies, and inflames old prejudices. But beneath it, something more human continues, the stubborn insistence that people are not their governments, and that stories can heal even when statistics cannot. As we turn to the next part, we will explore how these shifting dynamics affect third-party countries, multinational corporations, and the architecture of the post-World War II global trade system. When giants clash, it is often the bystanders who are trampled, or sometimes those who find unexpected opportunity. While Tokyo and Washington hurl economic thunderbolts at each other and cable news anchors froth over the East-West economic showdown of the century, the rest of the world stares, forks in hand, trying to eat dinner without getting trampled. For every big move in the Japan-United States trade war, there's a ripple across continents, sometimes a wave. Because when two G7 economies start swinging, someone's bound to drop a plate. Let us start with South Korea, that ever-nimble economic gymnast caught in the middle of every regional spat, but still managing to land on its feet. So, watching Japan and the United States descend into trade tantrums dusts off its old playbook, opportunistic diplomacy. Korean firms like Hyundai, Samsung, and LG accelerate talks with both American and Japanese partners. Let us be your plan B, they whisper. Washington listens. Tokyo listens. Korea smiles, pockets the contracts, and launches a new line of electronics with components sourced from neither of the feuding powers, just to show they can. China, meanwhile, sees an opening. Not to reconcile, Beijing has all the subtlety of a villain monologuing in the third act, but to wedge itself deeper into regional supply chains. It invites Japanese companies to relocate production from the United States to coastal China, offering tax incentives, fewer restrictions, and the quiet implication that we will not throw a tariff tantrum next month. For American firms frustrated with delays and rising costs, Chinese partners promise faster turnaround and friendlier faces. Sure, there is surveillance, censorship, and a lack of independent courts, but hey, your widgets arrive on time. The European Union, not wanting to be left out of the action or the drama, plays its usual role, the therapist with a clipboard. Brussels convenes emergency trade dialogues, issues strongly worded statements about the importance of rules-based global commerce, and politely suggests everyone consider mediation via the World Trade Organization. No one listens, but that is not the point. The point is moral superiority. Europe still likes its role as the adult in the room, even if the room is now full of flaming currency graphs and press releases written in all caps. Canada and Mexico, the perennial next-door neighbors, respond with a mixture of panic and profit-seeking. Mexican car part manufacturers see orders skyrocket as Japanese firms look for North American allies that are not, well, actively sabotaging them. Canadian tech startups suddenly find themselves courted by Japanese investors who have been ghosted by Silicon Valley. In response, the United States accuses both neighbors of undermining American trade resilience, prompting a hilariously awkward North American leaders summit where smiles are forced, handshakes are sweaty, and no one dares mention the word tariff until dessert. And then there are the corporations, those transnational creatures with no loyalty but to the quarterly report. Apple quietly shifts part of its chip supply chain away from Japan, not because it wants to, but because its stock price twitches whenever the word embargo trends. Toyota begins exploring factories in Vietnam and Indonesia, just in case the American market becomes too hostile. Amazon reviews its logistics contracts, while Microsoft tries to launch a diplomatic gaming initiative involving Japanese and American studios, because nothing says peace like a shared open-world sandbox. The World Bank issues a report that sounds like it was written by an intern with a nervous breakdown. If global protectionism trends persist, we may see cascading de-anchoring of investment confidence, eroding multilateral integration. Translation, everyone's spooked, but no one wants to blink first. Back in Geneva, the World Trade Organization meets to discuss the Japan-United States situation. Delegates from neutral countries give speeches that are equal parts cautious and passive-aggressive. While we respect each nation's right to defend its industry, says one Scandinavian envoy, we remind the Council that retaliatory tariff spirals rarely yield sustainable growth trajectories. In other words, please stop this madness before we all need new spreadsheets. Meanwhile, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Thailand quietly roll out red carpets for manufacturing giants. Their pitches are simple. We are not the United States, and we are not Japan. We are just very enthusiastic about your semiconductor plant. Please come. And some do. Ground is broken. Memorandums of understanding are signed. Southeast Asia begins humming with the energy of someone who just inherited an angry uncle's fortune.
But the real game changer is India.
Prime ministerial aides seized the moment to pitch India as the new conflict-free alternative, an English-speaking democracy with cheap labor and no trade war baggage. American companies take note. Japanese firms take meetings. Logistics hubs in Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh become the new darlings of trade magazines. The Financial Times runs an article titled, "India, the Unexpected Beneficiary of American Hubris," complete with an infographic showing Delhi smiling smugly as Tokyo and Washington bicker in the background. And as the global chessboard reshuffles, the very idea of a predictable, stable, rules-based trade order seems more like nostalgia than policy. The 1990s dream of seamless globalization, where goods would flow like water and politics stayed politely out of the way, now lies in the same graveyard as dial-up modems and NAFTA optimism. This is not just about one trade war. It is about the collapse of a system that assumed mature economies would act mature. Instead, we are watching billion-dollar tantrums, geopolitical subtweets, and cultural boycotts, all stitched together by bureaucrats pretending they are still in control. In the final part, we will ask, what if this trade war never ends? What if temporary tariffs become the new normal? And what does it mean for the next century of global leadership when the guardians of the system start setting fire to the rulebook? So here we are. After months of tit-for-tat tariffs, ministerial meltdowns, and global companies playing economic hopscotch from one country to another, we asked a final unsettling question: what if this trade war between Japan and the United States never really ends?
Because what if it is not a war at all, but a new permanent condition?
Trade wars used to be exceptions. Temporary breakdowns in an otherwise cooperative system. Like a couple fighting over who forgot the anniversary, but eventually making up because neither one wanted to pay for separate apartments. But now we are looking at something else entirely. The structural bones of global trade are warping, cracking under the weight of rising nationalism, industrial anxiety, and digital age paranoia. And the Japan-United States standoff might just be the canary, or more accurately, the sumo wrestler, in the coal mine. In Washington, the tariffs remain, but the political narrative has shifted. Politicians stop promising a quick resolution and begin selling economic independence as the new frontier. Presidential candidates compete over who can be tougher on foreign tech and autos. It becomes normal, almost patriotic, not to buy Japanese goods. Think back to the 1980s car smashing protests. Now fast forward. Imagine a made-for-streaming docuseries titled Taking Back the Garage, the American Automotive Revival, narrated by a former wrestler turned senator. In Tokyo, resignation takes root. Business leaders stop hoping for détente and begin rerouting entire decades-long supply chains. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, once obsessed with maintaining U.S. market access, now focuses on shoring up regional influence. Southeast Asia, India, maybe even a deeper alliance with Germany and France. Japanese tech moves towards self-sufficiency, fueled by government subsidies and quiet bitterness. The cultural shift is just as potent. Japanese public opinion hardens, media narratives grow sharper, and the younger generation, raised on manga and memes, starts asking why their parents ever idolized American brands in the first place. Meanwhile, global businesses adapt like bacteria in a hostile environment. Trade lawyers are hired en masse. Geoeconomic strategy becomes a must-have executive skill. Corporations build conflict buffers into logistics models, creating shadow supply chains that can be rerouted within days of a new sanction or tariff. What used to be called redundancy is now called resilience. The global trade map is redrawn, by necessity, not design.
In this new normal, we begin to forget how easy things used to be.
Gone are the days when you could assume your smartphone was assembled from parts touched by 5 continents. Gone are the quarterly earnings calls where companies blamed seasonal fluctuations rather than diplomatic hostilities with our largest supplier. Gone is the fantasy of politics staying politely in the background while the market hummed along like a happy Roomba. Instead, we get a world of informal blocks. Not Cold War-style alignments, there is no grand ideology being fought over. Just raw, unfiltered economic power games. The United States increasingly inward and unpredictable. Japan, cautious but determined. China, opportunistic. The European Union, exhausted but still waving the rule book.
And everyone else? They're just trying to stay out of the way and make a buck where they can. The real cost is not just money, it is momentum.
Trade used to be the grease in the wheels of global progress. It was not perfect, but it kept nations talking, cooperating, and building shared interests. When you rely on someone for semiconductors or airplane parts, you think twice before launching a press release calling them economic parasites. But if that reliance breaks down, if nations start assuming the worst, planning for rupture rather than repair, then we enter a darker phase of global history.
A future where the baseline assumption is not cooperation, but conflict. Where trade talks are less about compromise and more about leverage. Where leaders score points by burning bridges. And so the question becomes, who wins in a world like this?
Is it the protectionists proudly standing beside shuttered factories and claiming victory while inflation creeps up and innovation slows? Is it the strategic, quietly shifting gears, making just enough friends to get by, but always one diplomatic gaffe away from disruption? Or is it the opportunist, the one who sells to both sides, says nothing controversial, and quietly grows in the background while giants punch each other in the face? In reality, no one truly wins a trade war. At best, they survive it. At worst, they redefine it until war becomes the baseline and peace the anomaly.
So the next time you hear a politician talk about tariffs as short-term pain for long-term gain, ask them who's pain and who's gain.
Because if Superman cannot outshine Marvel at the box office, it is disappointing. But if Japan and the United States cannot outgrow a tariff spat without tearing holes in the global economy, it is tragic. This has been What If Horizons. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who still believes trade wars are good and easy to win. And if you think we are headed for a world where national flags matter more than global cooperation, tell us your thoughts. We will be back next time with a new question, a new scenario, and the same old voice daring to ask, what if the future is not what you were promised? Until then, keep questioning, keep imagining, and keep an eye on your supply chain.